Hello. Oh my God, it's the afternoon. It's the graveyard slot. Thank you for having me here. This is a really beautiful place to be talking about our dirty homes. I was meant to be giving a talk about smart homes, and I thought, well, it's the UN Climate Summit this week. It would be stupid not to make a mention of how much we contribute in our everyday life to climate change, and also to give us some food for thought and some practical actions, because I think that Greta Thunberg has certainly put in my mind that practical actions is kind of what we should be aiming for. So I thought that I would talk about the smart home. I thought that I would talk about where it comes from, and also I think what are some of the things that you and I could probably think about and probably spread around us, as Rakesh told me to really fundamentally think about what the big messages would be for the future. A little bit about me. So I'm a consultant. I've been based here for 12 years. I run the Internet of Things meetup. I was the first UK distributor of an electronics education platform called the Arduino, and I've just written a book about smart homes. I'm also currently working with a company that's incubated by ING, and so lots of fintech work, and I'm writing a new book on corporate innovation cultures. But I thought today we would go through, in the next 13 minutes, stuff about your home, how you contribute to climate change with the everyday things that you do, and how you can maybe do something about it. So what is your home predominantly made of? Your home is a pseudo-factory. If you go back to how people have been developing the home space as a private space over the last 100 years, your home has been trying to tell you things about how you live that are very much like factory work. Christine Fredericks was a researcher in the United States. She wasn't an official researcher, she just worked for herself, but she eventually grew the first women-led advertising agency in the US. What she did in her spare time is build an entire body of work of how you, as usually a housewife or usually a servant, could be leading a more effective and more efficient household. So for example, this is one of the layouts that she has in her book in 1912 that shows women what a non-official or non-effective layout looks like. People have been trying to sell, mostly to women, the idea that homes are like factories that could be made more efficient for over 100 years. And I think that's a really interesting concept that we're still kind of stuck with. People have also been selling the idea that the home is a heterogeneous system that is still a system somehow. So in 1987, the National Association of Home Builders in America had the first event that used this expression, smart house. They eventually trademarked the word smart house, and so in order to talk about connectivity in the home space, people had to use another term because it was trademarked, so smart homes started emerging simply because of IP reasons. But it was the idea that your home is somehow something that is crying out for technological infrastructure that did not exist at the time, except it kind of already did. We also live in spaces that get bigger. Perhaps not in this country, but you could sort of argue that in outside of very urbanized areas like London, it does. The average US home certainly has increased in size, almost doubled in size in the last 100 years. So we have been extremely successful at filling that space with lots and lots of things that demand power, that need to be plugged in, lots of rooms that become their own universe of things that are plugged in. Every single bedroom used to have a television in the 90s, and then every single bedroom now has the child's phone, laptop, etc. So all of these spaces we have crammed full of things that draw power. And they are also spaces which we are ambivalent about. We're extremely ambivalent about our own consumption. Marie Kondo is not a success for no reason. We like to think of the space as somehow being a space that we can minimize. And so this idea of the minimal home, minimum home unit has also been something that's been a concept that has been around since the late 1800s. And we keep, the black square here is the size of the bed. We kind of keep thinking around what to do with these spaces. Very creepily enough, the co-living spaces of London today are just about the same size as a prison cell. And we, again, I'll continue making this point here, we continue to have spaces that have a huge amount of demand in terms of power. For the last 100 years, we have been sold the idea that electricity is an absolute infrastructure that is essential to modern life. So the picture on the left-hand side is the first electric light bulbs, which were invented in the UK. And we're set up in Craigside, outside of Newcastle. I recommend you go visit that if you have the chance. And in the picture to the right is the first time that the White House had Christmas lights that were electric Christmas lights. And because the president had it, everybody had to have it. And they had to wait until 1902 until Christmas lights were commercially available. But we've been talking this up the whole time. We've been talking up the fact that you needed everything connected to electricity for a long time. And we've used the full force of mass media, whether that was print media or advertising, eventually cinema. We've used everything to make sure that a life electric, which was the expression at the time, was embraced by everyone. And we, of course, have also lived with a degree of servitude. So I'm glad that David left the room because I can talk about Alexa in not so glowing terms, but the idea of servitude is built into how we think about home space. We are constantly trying to make up for the fact that it's not so cool for us to have live-in servants, so we have people help us in a very ad hoc basis as part of the gig economy. We rely on people in ways that are very like the servants we used to have 100 years ago, but it's less inconvenient or less taxing psychologically than it used to be. So how does this make us contribute to climate change very actively? I think there's lots of different ways in which we do. Firstly, obviously with the things that we have bought, whether it was smart home type appliances or things that label themselves as smart home, we used to do fairly well with spaces that were mostly, or lives that were mostly lived in communities. So on the left-hand side is from the Black Country Museum. And that is the average kitchen space, which had kind of enough for you to make breakfast and sort of enough for you to just iron all the things and dry all the things at home. But you were doing a lot of shift work, so you weren't spending an awful lot of time at home. Your family was mostly living in the city, eating out, and relying on infrastructure around you an infrastructure around you that was other people's ovens and bakeries, restaurants, etc. So you lived a very communal life, whereas now we are trying as much as possible to isolate ourselves from our high street, which might not, in a way, contribute to the growth of our high street particularly, and we've connected everything up. These things are also always on. So a smart television, for example, is 100% more on than a dumb television used to be because it is constantly drawing power. That's not how we get sold these devices, but that's the reality. We also are still existing in an infrastructure of habits that's very post-industrial. The demand on the national grid every single day in the UK peaks in the morning when most of you will get up and peaks in the evening when most of you will make dinner and or do a whole bunch of things. But it hasn't fundamentally changed in 100 years or so. And of course, we know that our grid isn't particularly green. This is a fantastic visualization on a website called iamkate.com. And all of the links to this presentation I have on my slides, which I have just tweeted before. We live in a world where our demand has increased and therefore the provision has increased, and that provision is very complicated. We also have habits that are entirely of our own making because of our lifestyles. If you're slightly older, you'll tend to heat your house a little bit more. If you're living on your own, you have enough disposable time to do different washes for different colors and towels and this, that, and the other. Whereas if you're in a family home with lots of kids, you dump everything in and you just stop caring, which means you use the washing machine less often. That's very, very well documented research in a fantastic report published in 2012. And of course, your home is probably an immense leak of energy continuously because of the way in which it was built. Weirdly, some of the homes in this country that were built pre-1919 are more efficient at keeping the heat in than post-war homes. So the idea that an ancestral Victorian home is worse is not necessarily the case. And they also leak at night. So you're charging all your devices. These are devices that are on chargers that aren't particularly smart, so it'll just keep topping up and just keep charging. We used to talk about it as vampire power. We used to have the habit of switching everything off at the plug. People have mostly lost those habits in the last 10 years because we just, go to bed, plug a thing in, and charge it, and overcharge it or continually charge it throughout the entire night. That's not particularly great, and it does increase usage. Our web services that we consume in our home very actively are also huge spenders of energy. So that's an expense that we don't necessarily see, but it is an expense to the national grid and to our entire planet. And eventually, as we move from petrol vehicles to electric vehicles, well, we're plugging that in at home as well. So then we're increasing demand potentially at nighttime, even if we might move away from peak demand, let's say between 6 and 9, we might plug something in the evening. So that does add something, and it certainly adds to our energy bills. Not in a bad way, and that's still a transition we need to go through, but it does add up. So some small thoughts on what you can do about it, and I will caveat the next 3 minutes and say that I was head of innovation at Bulb, which is an energy company in this country. Every little helps. I believe fundamentally that no matter how minimal your change, it does help. The internet is absolutely full of recommendations of what to do, from the lighting that you have to the home appliances that you choose. And the problem is we don't change our home appliances very often. We'll change our fridge and our washing machines between every 7 years and 12 years. A lot of technologies have moved on in the very recent 5-10-year period. So if you haven't changed your washing machine and you have a chance to move it to a AAA graded appliance can make a big difference. Things like that. Read your EPC. Who knows where their EPC is in their home? Who knows what an EPC is? So it's a super simple thing, but when you bought your home or you moved in, your landlord or as part of your buying package, you have a certificate that says how green or not green your home is. And it includes recommendations. It's called an EPC. If you can't find it, it's online because the government just republished it this July. So you can find your own EPC, you can find your own address and your own postcode, and you can find out how bad, quote unquote, your own home is. And that's graded from A to G. A lot of properties in this country tend to go towards the G, but it does include recommendations because someone has gone into your home and made an assessment because it's required by law since 2010. Thank you, European Commission. Avoid the rebound effect. So even if you might be doing some things, don't overspend because you're doing something. So keep an eye on the idea that you're contributing no matter what you do. I think that's extremely important. And yes, it's all terribly expensive. The government has been trying to get involved in helping us make changes to our home to make them more efficient. It's very, very difficult. It's extremely expensive, and a lot of these schemes are not very successful. But I do think that there's a role for government to play at some point. So my last slide for you today, think about what your habits are now, think about what they'll be later. As you age in your own home, your habits will change. As the kids move away, your habits will change. So think about what that means. Save money if you can to do something about the recommendations in your EPC. And please, please just find out what your EPC says because it's an amazing tool that everybody has and no one knows how to use. Thank you very much.